Welcome to Methods, Classes, and Clinical Practice, a Crisis of Misalignment. I'm Jessica Neuman, and I'm here with Rob Wieman. We're from Rowan University, and we are here to talk a little bit about our own clinical practice program. We are going to start today with voices from our clinical practice program.
I wake up in the morning and say, I don't want to go.
Nobody has good student teaching experiences. I was really excited to start student teaching, but it was absolutely awful.
Part of me wishes I had dropped out right before student teaching.
It's one of the worst experiences of my life.
When we hear these voices from our program, we ask ourselves, what should we do? How do we fix this?
Okay, so before we figure out what we should do, we think one thing that we really need to do is kind of look under the hood and figure out what exactly is going on. Why are they having such awful experiences? It's certainly not because we want them to have awful experiences. So the first thing that we did to figure out what was going on is we read research. We asked, what do other people think is going on? And what research tells us is that for pre-service teachers, student teaching is an incredibly powerful experience. For many of them, it's their most educative experience. It's the one where they learn the most in their pre-service teaching programs. And it's incredibly powerful for them in both positive and negative ways. We've also learned that for policymakers and program coordinators, it's seen as a crucial part of teacher education. It's universal in the United States. All programs have student teaching. Indeed, many programs, alternative programs, that's all they do is clinical practice, or they do much more clinical practice than the traditional programs. And yet researchers have also found that clinical practice, despite its universality, despite its power, despite how crucial it is, clinical practice is highly variable, both between and within programs. And often clinical practice is really misaligned. That what student teachers learn in their university-based methods classes does not align with what they're doing, finding, seeing in their clinical practice. So from research, we wanted to look at what's happening in our local context, what's happening in our program. Can we dig a little deeper into the lives of these student teachers who are having such difficult experiences? So Jess and I created a survey, and we surveyed supervisors, student teachers, methods instructors, and cooperating teachers, and we interviewed them. And we wanted to know just the most basic thing. What do you do when you're a student teacher? What activities do you do? What goals do you have? And what successes and challenges have you met? The first step was just to see, what are they actually doing in student teaching? And we have some ideas, but are those ideas true? And our initial finding was that they were not enjoying student teaching. It was a really difficult experience for them. And so the question remains, why? So when we dig deeper, we found that one of the biggest problems for interns was they felt really unprepared for student teaching. And in particular, they felt unprepared for planning and for classroom management. These were things they had to do every day, things that were high stress for them, and they felt not at all prepared and ready to do these things. So what was really ironic and difficult to hear was that the methods instructor, me, had really concentrated on preparing students to plan and preparing them for classroom management. So why is it that the very thing I worked so hard to prepare them for was exactly the thing they felt unprepared for? Why? Why is this misalignment still there, even if we work so much at trying to avoid it?
When we explore the why, we come up with this word again, misalignment. And we found particularly that there were three areas of misalignment that were different between the methods class and what they were seeing in clinical practice. So the first misalignment that we found was really around planning. In methods class, we focused in the course on specific instructional routines, like things I notice, contemplate, then calculate, which one doesn't belong. We designed these routines and embedded them in instruction so that students would be exploring different ways of thinking, but also so that it became sort of second nature in terms of how they were planning and could be transferred to clinical practice. What interns found when they entered clinical practice was that there were different routines that were expected of them. Guided notes, things that we were not introducing into the course. Additionally, the cycle of planning was very different. We had them rehearsing, revising, thinking about lesson plans for a long period of time and digging deeply into them, whereas in clinical practice, they found that their lesson planning structure was one and done. We do a lesson plan, we do it, we move on. There wasn't a lot of reflection and circling back. In methods classes, we also focused on having students work together with their instructor, collaborate, exchange ideas. But in clinical practice, interns really found that their lesson planning practices were really individual. And I think this was a big shock for them when they moved into clinical practice. We also allowed lots of time and energy for one activity. So we gave them a longer period of time to plan a lesson. But then they had little time for many lessons in their clinical practice. So overall, planning in methods class didn't transfer to planning in clinical practice, which created this misalignment. Similarly, our second misalignment really revolved around management. In our methods class, we had students set up environments through specific routines. In clinical practice, the classroom and school environment was already set up. So the routines that they were in charge of in their methods class hypothetically didn't necessarily transfer because their clinical practice environment was already set up for them. The explicit norms and moves that we were teaching and focusing on in methods class didn't necessarily match the implicit norms and moves that were already set up by their classroom teacher and expected of them in clinical practice. And we focused in methods class around management really on focusing on anticipating student behaviors. While we're lesson planning, we're thinking about how can we prevent misbehavior, take into account what might happen, anticipate how a student might respond. But in clinical practice, interns were really focused on reacting to misbehavior based on the clinical practice environment. They were focused on rewards and punishments because the lesson planning structure was different, and it didn't seem to transfer. So that management and methods classes also didn't transfer to clinical practice. And finally, zooming out a little bit, our interviews with interns also revealed that their program goals didn't necessarily match our program goals. So our program really focused on giving interns the power and the skills and knowledge that supported effective teaching. So learning specific teacher moves, learning how to anticipate that typical student thinking or behavior, developing a habit of reflection were all goals that we wanted to see them transfer and skills that we wanted to see them transfer into their clinical practice environment. But when interns described their experience and their goals for clinical practice, they really had more goals around identity as a teacher. They wanted to develop an identity, to feel comfortable in front of a class, to develop confidence, to learn what it would feel like to teach. They weren't thinking about bringing these skills from methods into real clinical practice. And that's a big misalignment in terms of how we're moving forward together in partnership.
So for us, this is an old story. We want teacher candidates to be student-centered. We want them to learn how to teach in ways where they start where their students are, and they start with what their students know. This is really important to us. Yet when we're teaching them how to teach, the goals we have for them are far from their own experience, both past and future. We're not actually that student-centered. We're kind of teacher-centered, or At least I've been kind of teacher-centered. So how can we bring our own philosophy to bear on this crisis now? How can we make teaching how to teach be more student-centered for the future teachers that we're teaching? So we have some ideas for some things that we can do in the short term. So in methods classes, one thing we can do is try to bring the experiences that they're going to have and they've had closer to the experiences that we're teaching them about. So if we want them to teach using routines, we can share these routines with their mentor teachers. We can we can create more of those routines in the classrooms they're going to be teaching in. Share those routines with mentor teachers so that those things are not so strange, that they actually happen in the classrooms they're teaching under. A second thing we can do is teach them to plan, teach our teacher candidates to plan under more realistic constraints. So we can say, if what they're going to do in their classrooms is teach using particular curriculum materials, we should give them experiences of teaching using particular curriculum materials. If they need to plan a lesson in 20 minutes, we should give them an experience of planning a lesson in 20 minutes. So we can have what we teach them how to do be more like what they're going to do.
In the long term, we also want to find systemic ways to improve the clinical practice experience. And based on our research, we really need to attend to identity, not only in our own program, but also making sure that we're collaborating with teachers and districts to address student-teacher identity. And that collaboration needs to extend beyond that. We need to do a better job of making sure that the classrooms our teacher candidates enter mimic and reflect the learning and the training that they're getting in their methods class.
And vice versa, that the learning in their methods class actually aligns with the class that they're going to. But in looking at this potential action, this is action of us as teacher educators. So we have another question.
What about research? How do researchers respond to urgent crises? What do we do as researchers to make this problem disappear? It's complicated.
So yes, it's complicated. So as researchers, so this is really complicated. So one of the things that seems really, really prevalent in research in education is this gap between research and practice. And so this is another old story. And we think that one of the reasons that this is true is that there's sort of different cultures of research and practitioners, and that they have different values and understandings of pretty basic things, like what counts as knowledge, what counts as useful, and how long does it take for new ideas to sort of get out there and be usable, and how good does it have to be? So as teacher educators, I feel, as a teacher educator, I feel a sense of urgency. I need to address these problems right away. I can't wait for someone else to generate knowledge about this thing that is vetted by reviewers before I can use it. Like, the problem is right there in front of me. I need to figure out something to do now, especially when I have student teachers saying, this is the worst experience of my life. I wake up and I don't want to go. I wish I had quit before I even started student teaching. But as a researcher, it takes forever to get stuff out there. So we have these dilemmas around where do we put our time? Where do we put our energy? What counts as knowledge, and who are we generating it for? And that as researchers, the knowledge we're generating takes a long time and doesn't get a lot of play with practitioners in the moment of urgency when they have it. So I guess we're saying we don't really know the answer to this question, but I don't know, maybe I'm speaking for just myself, but I feel a moral urgency to, in the lack of knowledge, do something anyway, which sounds like a very non-researcher stance. So I guess I don't have an answer to what do we do as researchers. What do you think, Jess?
I think that our sort of short-term answer is really sharing the knowledge that we do have, which is sharing this with you and presenting and with you all virtually, and presenting and creating opportunities for us to collaborate, which is why we'd like to solicit your input and feedback and hopefully get answers to the questions that we are wondering about, not only our project, but also what's going on in your particular setting. So are these issues and the dilemmas that we're even trying to tackle similar to or different from your own experience? What have you done to solve, if possible, some of the things that have come up in your program and experience? And what other ideas or suggestions or questions do you have for us as we begin to tackle both the immediate things that we know we want to address and also those longer systemic solutions that we have? So we'd love for you to participate in a Google form /poll where we can engage together in talking and sharing knowledge around this, which I think is a first step in perhaps tackling some of those big dilemmas. So if you could go to the link by either clicking there, if possible, or if that's not possible through the way this is shared, if you could go to that short link, we would really appreciate hearing from you.
And thank you very much. We've enjoyed presenting.